Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you, people who are here, but also people who are here online, to Trinity, the beginning of Trinity Forum's November mini-series that will shine a few spotlights on the diverse perspective of religion in Eastern Europe. And just by chance, we're also starting this within the range of the Diwali, the Hindu festival of light. So we're still celebrating that. So it's a part of a diverse perspective, if you will. In the next 2 weeks, Dr. Mary Cunningham, who is an emeritus professor of historical theology at Nottingham University in England, will speak on the Eastern Orthodox Church, its historical developments, as well as the role of women in modern Orthodox Church practices. But today, to kick us off, is Martha Wexler, who is a journalist. Will be discussing a scam that she uncovered involving sacred Torah rolls that were marketed as survivors of Jewish communities destroyed by Hitler. Martha's a longtime journalist with a background in Russian studies. After working at the Voice of America Russian Service and Worldwide English newsroom, she moved to National Public Radio, where she served as an editor for Europe and the former Soviet Union, and also reported occasionally from Russia. Martha worked as a show editor for all the major NPR news magazine programs. In the mid-2000s, while editing part-time for the network, Martha reported the story for the geography. She reported this story for the Washington Post magazine that she'll discuss today. So Martha, without further ado, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, albeit virtually, to talk about this story that consumed my attention really for years. And frankly, I've dined out on it for more than a decade now. I just want to correct the record a little bit. I'm not going to be able to shed any light on religion in Eastern Europe. This sheds light on religion in the United States, on a religious community in the United States. So in the briefest of nutshells, this is a story of a man who presented himself as dedicated to the Word of God. And he claimed to be retrieving sacred Torah scrolls from communities, from places where the Jewish communities had been largely destroyed by Hitler. And he would bring these scrolls back from Europe and restore them, and then sell them to congregations, dozens of congregations, or individual donors who would then donate them to congregations. So I think before we start, I just want to give you a brief summary of what a Torah scroll is. Some of you may have seen it. You may have gone to someone's bar mitzvah or gone to a synagogue service. So if we could just pull up images and share screen one and two, images 1 and 2, would that be possible? While we're waiting for that, I will just say that the Torah scroll is the 5 books of Moses. It is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It is always handwritten by a scribe in Hebrew. The text is penned on parchment from a kosher animal, like a cow or a sheep, with special ink. There we go. And you can see it's a scroll, and rather than touch it because it's delicate, when someone reads from it, they hold a silver pointer, right? It's called a hand, the yad. As you can see from the left side, this is kind of a long text, and this is the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's made up of these parchment panels, 60, 62, something like that, that are stitched together. For a Torah scroll to be kosher, that is to say fit for ritual use, every single one of the 304,805 letters must be correct. Something's incorrect, it's not kosher. It has to be fixed, corrected. If it's torn or smudged or a letter gets cracked, it needs to be corrected. A scribe will come in and make the repairs. The text, of course, it's the Bible. It's immutable. The scribe does not sign his name or write the place where there we go. You can get a better idea of the scale of the thing. This is unfurled. So the scribe does not write his name, does not write the date when he completed it, does not say where he was copying the text. As you can imagine, there were certain styles. Torahs written in North Africa have one kind of penmanship, calligraphy. An expert could say, oh, this looks like a German scroll from the late 19th century. It has very ornate curlicues on the letters, but the text is the same. The other very important thing to know about the Torah, it is the centerpiece of the Jewish religion. It is read, actually chanted according to a system of cantillation over the course of the year in the entirety, from the first chapter of Genesis, we just had it a few weeks ago, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, to the final chapter of Deuteronomy, where Moses dies in Moab, never having reached the promised land. And so every week you read part of it and you keep rolling that scroll because you're reading it in order. And it is this most sacred text from which the rabbis derived over the millennia Jewish scholarship and law. The German poet Heinrich Heine called the Torah the portable homeland of the Jewish people. Devout Jews, the Orthodox Jews, believe it is literally the word of God that was dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai, not just the Ten Commandments. More liberal Jews would, respect or revere the Torah as the centerpiece of the Jewish religion, I'd say, and Jewish civilization. Torah scrolls, when they're not being read, are kept in an ark. It's a cupboard. It's called an ark, I guess, like the Ark of the Covenant. We could maybe pull up that third slide. You could see a typical kind of suburban synagogue ark. You can go to an old synagogue in Europe, would be very fancy and ornate, maybe marble or alabaster or something like this. But there you go. And so there are several Torah scrolls, and you can see they, when they're all rolled up, furled, they're generally in the European tradition covered in cloth, often velvet. This thing in the middle looks like a box that looks like a Sephardic or North African or Middle Eastern scroll, maybe Iraqi Jewish community or something like that. They just happen to have one. And you can see there's silver ornaments. When the Torah is taken out to the ark to be read in the service, the congregation stands in respect. Before it's read, the Torah is paraded around. Worshippers might kiss their prayer shawls and then touch that shawl to the Torah as it passes by. So you got it, highly symbolic ritual object. And during the Holocaust, as you know, the Nazis destroyed synagogues, desecrated Torah scrolls, most famously on Kristallnacht on November 9th, 1938, when Nazi mobs rampaged through Jewish businesses and synagogues and destroying property and lives. For this reason, during the war, some Jewish communities would bury their Torah scrolls or give them to Gentile neighbors or hide them behind a wall or, try to keep them out of the hands of the occupying Nazi troops. So after the war, sadly, there weren't too many Jewish survivors, but, those who did survive sometimes went back and retrieved their Torah scrolls that they had hidden during the war. Most ended up then being in countries that were now under communist rule: Poland, the Ukrainian Republic of the USSR, the Baltic states, now in part of the Soviet Union under Soviet occupation, Czechoslovakia, Romania. And so these so-called survivor scrolls then spent a lot of the post-war years maybe in warehouses, or museums of religion and atheism that were, in the Soviet Union, because of course religion was discouraged, to put it mildly, under the communist rule. Okay, so this is all the history. Now, fast forward to the late 1990s, and enter the main character in my story. This is a diminutive man named Menachem Yulis, went by the title rabbi. He had studied at a religious college seminary in Baltimore, where he actually lives. He had some training as a Torah scribe. trained in the intricate art of penning the text. And when I met him, there he is. He is the proprietor of the Jewish bookstore of Greater Washington in the suburban Maryland, outside Washington, D.C. And you can see he's got a turkey quill. You actually do pen with a quill. You don't use a big pen to do this, right? There's special ink. And there he is. He's an Orthodox Jew, an ultra-Orthodox Jew. There he is in his shop. I mean, he's selling various Judaica, Hanukkah menorahs and things like that as well. And he also, in addition to the books and the Judaica objects, and being a scribe, he was what's known as like a Torah broker. If a synagogue needed a Torah for their worship services, they would contact him. He would, contact the people who write the scrolls. Most of them are in Israel actually now, and commission the writing of a scroll. Or if a synagogue community, if the congregation didn't have enough money to buy a new Torah, he would find an old one, a used one that another synagogue didn't need anymore. It's less expensive, like a used car, it's less expensive. Okay, so this is all the necessary background. You've got the what, the Torahs, and the who, Menachem Yulis. Okay. And so I first meet him, there he is again, in May of 2005. I was working as the senior editor at Weekend All Things Considered at NPR headquarters in Washington. I got a call from a reporter friend of mine in New York who said, "Oh, I've got a really good story, make a really good radio segment on the weekend." And the story is this: my parents' synagogue, which was in suburban Maryland, again, Silver Spring, Maryland, is about to dedicate for worship a Torah scroll that had been at the Auschwitz concentration camp. And I don't know many details about it, my friend says, but I don't know, it sounded intriguing. It did sound intriguing. I mean, how could there be a Torah scroll in a concentration camp? I mean, the print image there, from what we know, barely had crumbs of bread to eat, right? How, did they have secrete a Torah scroll away somewhere? What is this? So I was intrigued, decided to invite in the man who claimed to have retrieved this scroll from Europe, and as well as the brother and sister who were purchasing it from him in order to donate to the synagogue. And the reason they were making the donation was they wanted to honor their mother, the brother and sister. Their mother had been in Auschwitz. She was a survivor. And so this was a gesture. You see, we are continuing the Jewish faith, the religion. It's a symbol of continuity. So producer and I worked up a set of questions in order to elicit the story from Yulis. And by this time, some of his adventures had been written up in the Jewish press particularly, but also some other mainstream publications. And he had gained this reputation of being the Jewish Indiana Jones, the raider of lost arks. Okay. So he comes into our studio, sits down behind the microphone. The producer was actually asking him the questions. I was sitting behind a glass wall in the control room. I can talk to her through her headphones, though, in case I have follow-up questions. And we're listening to his story. She asked him to tell the story. And this is what he told us. And I'm just going to try to remember as best I can. Actually, we taped the interview and there's a transcript. So I went and sort of refreshed myself. And I want to use some of the phrases that he used when he was describing his adventure, retrieving this Torah that had been in the Auschwitz camp. He tells us 3 customers came into his shop, this Jewish bookstore, and they told him that they had seen an ad on the internet for an old Torah scroll for $17,000. And then Yulis says he told them, wait, $17,000? That's a lot of money for an old scroll. I'm not interested. A 4th customer comes into his shop, grabs him by the collar, slams him into his office chair, powers up his computer, and points to the ad for the $17,000 old scroll, Torah scroll. This customer scrolls down, and there is a warning. This ad comes with a dire warning. If no one comes forward to buy this Torah scroll in 2 weeks, I'm going to burn this scroll, and you will see a video of it burning on the internet. This is like an act of desecration along the lines of what the Nazis did, right? So of course, as a devout Jew, he has to spring into action, and he travels to Europe, tells us to the Federal Republic of Germany, to meet the man who is selling this Torah scroll. He finds that it is a man in his 80s with, quote, piercing blue eyes. He's over 6 feet tall. And Euless brings him a cashier's check from, quote, a major American bank for $17,000 and asks for the Torah scroll. This tall old man scoffs at him and says, I won't take this check. This check is no good. I will only take my payment in gold. So, and I want gold in 24 hours, or I burn the Torah scroll. So fortunately, Euless tells our producer, I had experience like this in Eastern Europe before. Eastern Europe, we're in Germany, but whatever. Okay, so he tells us, I called an associate in Russia and asked him to get me gold. Okay, after placing that call to his associate, Euless says he goes back up to the old man's apartment and says, could you just tell me, how did this Torah scroll come into your possession? And the old man says, oh, I beat a Jew to death and took the Torah scroll. And Menachem Euless then says, so I asked him, would you care to elaborate? This old man proceeds to confess that he had been a guard at the Auschwitz camp. And in 1944, when a transport of Jews was coming off a train in boxcars from the Uzsgöre ghetto, it was then called Ungvar in Hungary, there was an old man in this transport of Jews, and he was clinging to a Torah scroll, and he forgot, he refused to give up the scroll when ordered to do so by the Nazi guards. So this particularly vicious guard, unrepentant anti-Semite, beat him to death and held on to the Torah scroll because I figured you people would want it back one day, whatever. Okay. So none of this made a lot of sense. There was another, detail. He somehow knew the name of the old man. It was Sender, because he knew that somebody in this line of Jews waiting to enter Auschwitz had called out the old man's name, referred to the Torah scroll. We don't know how he magically transported himself to the scene, but so we had a lot of questions. But remember now, Euless is waiting. The story goes on. Euless is waiting for his associate to get him the $17,000 in gold bullion so that he can ransom this sacred object. The next day, in fact, the gold arrives. Euless takes it back upstairs, hands it to the unrepentant Auschwitz guard, who then flings the Torah scroll at him. Euless manages to catch it, runs downstairs, meets the associate who had brought him the gold, and, quote, using a code word we had used before, I signaled to him to spirit it out of the country. Okay. Euless then hands the Torah scroll to his associate, gets in a car, drives to the airport. 3 minutes into his trip to the airport, 3 men drive him off the road, start beating him up severely, demanding the Torah scroll back. Why, we weren't sure. They knock out his 2 front teeth, and he's concussed. Somehow they realize he doesn't have the Torah scroll. He gets back in the car, drives to the airport, gets on the plane, bleeding and concussed. Okay. The story gets more and more improbable. The Torah scroll is spirited out of Germany by his associate, arrives in Maryland. Menachem Euless gets to work as a scribe, restores it, and now we're going to be rededicating it for worship purposes at this suburban Maryland synagogue. Okay, after Euless told his story, we talked to the brother and sister who were purchasing it to honor their mother, the Auschwitz survivor. Lo and behold, their mother is from the same area in Hungary where the old man in the story is from. And lo and behold, she had a cousin whose name was Sender, another coincidence. Anyway, the NPR producer and I had lots of questions. We followed up. What was the name of the Auschwitz guard? Don't you want to bring this man to justice? He's eluded justice all these years. I'm not at liberty to say. My lawyer tells me I can't tell you. In any case, he's died of cancer. When did this happen? Long, pregnant pause. We start prompting him. Well, it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Where exactly in Germany was this? I can't tell you. Let's just say it used to be divided by a wall. Okay, all these sort of gratuitous, Cold War intrigue details, right? Can you show us the ad for this Torah scroll with a warning about burning it? No, my computer is broken. The guy's here fixing it. Of course, we called eBay and other sites, and nobody, they all reminded us, look, when you purchase something on eBay, you pay with a credit card or PayPal. You don't present payment to the seller directly. Okay. Long story, very long story short. We just don't run this segment. We don't send a producer to the synagogue for the very moving Torah rededication ceremony. We just let the matter drop because I can't put this on the air because it's just not checking out and it's just strains credulity in every way. Drop it. Joke about it, but drop it. 3 years later, my other reporter friend who alerted me to the story, and I open up the New York Times, and we see a story about another Torah scroll, which had also been rescued by the Jewish Indiana Jones Menachem Yulis. This one he had supposedly exhumed from the town of Ashvinshim, where it was buried. This scroll was purchased by the private equity billionaire David Rubenstein. He's now the chairman of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts here in Washington. He owns a contemporaneous copy of the Magna Carta, which is on loan to the archives. This is a man who gave $10 million to the Mount Vernon for the George Washington Presidential Library. Anyway, so this is somebody who should have, been checking provenance. But anyway, he purchases this scroll and is giving it to Central Synagogue in New York for, it's a prominent, wealthy synagogue, and it gets a lot of publicity. It's written up in the New York Times. At this point, Jeff and I start looking around and looking through other press articles, and we realize he's been selling dozens of these Torah scrolls, and with all these very exciting yet heartwarming stories of rescue attached to them, to dozens of communities. So anyway, after this New York Times story appears, Jeff, this other reporter, and I did, as I say, we did some research, and we're seeing all these other scroll stories. We realized that there a wealthy man who was a customer at the Jewish bookstore in Washington had started a nonprofit foundation, the goal of which was to finance the rescue missions of Menachem Yulis in Eastern and Central Europe to go after these Torah scrolls. This nonprofit foundation put up a fundraising video on the internet, and it had a lot of testimonials to Menachem Yulis's fine character and amazing determination, and it was from his customers, and they told the stories behind their Torahs. There was the mass grave story. We of course found out through our research that 6 different purchasers believed that they had one of 2 Torah scrolls that Yulis supposedly dug up from a mass grave in Kamenets-Podolsk. This is a horrible incident early in the Holocaust where the Nazis just marched, 20,000 or more Jews from corner of Hungary, Slovakia, and into Ukraine, and they were stripped and shot in mass graves. Somehow 2 Torah scrolls were there in Gestapo body bags, whatever that is, and they survived. All right. One story on this fundraising website or a video test was, particularly easy to disprove. A woman rabbi told the story of the Torah scroll that she had purchased, which Menachem Yulis had supposedly discovered when he was touring the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp site. And he fell through the floorboards, lo and behold, what's there but a Torah scroll. And anyway, after some negotiations, he spirits it or gets it out or whatever. It's now, in suburban Northern Virginia, right? Well, this is impossible. When the British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen in 1945, they found there was a typhus epidemic that was raging and killing many of the inmates. And so what they ended up doing was burning every structure on that campsite. They evacuated the remaining inmates, but they burned everything to the ground. There was no floorboard for Menachem to fall through and find a Torah scroll. So this was easy. Anyway, we found several of these so-called smoking Torah stories, as we joked. Stories that just could not be true. You could just absolutely disprove them. And then we pitched the story to the Washington Post magazine, which published our article. That last picture you saw was actually of Euless in the shop when my co-reporter went to him before publication to find out if he had any evidence corroborating any of these stories. You have to do that. You have to say, okay, you're claiming that you did this. Could you show us some proof? Could you show us a picture of a Torah scroll as you exhumed it, or the box you found it in, or the name of somebody that you got this from? Or okay, there was 0, 0, 0. So we wrote our, magazine piece. The Justice Department, actually the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, read the expose in the Washington Post magazine and then began investigating. And then, so we published in January 2010, and in early 2011, the Justice Department charged him with one count of mail and one count of wire fraud. And he was sentenced to 51 months. The sentencing was in 2012. One thing that the federal investigators were able to determine was that they pulled his passport. We couldn't do that. You can't do that for privacy considerations, but the federal investigators did. He'd never been to Europe during this time. So these adventures were just pure figments of his imagination. And Save a Torah, this foundation, which was created to finance these purported adventures, never asked for a travel receipt, never asked for a hotel bill, never asked for anything. So he accumulated a lot of money. He didn't actually spend it on things, so he was able to pay $800,000 in restitution. I think he ended up accumulating 1.5 million or whatever, but he did give people actual Torah. So that's the con that we investigated. But the story, raised many other deeper questions. Where was he getting all these Torahs? They were real Torahs. They were real old Torahs. It looked like, and experts inspected them, and it looked like they were from Europe, written before the war. Well, it turns out there are a lot of old Torah scrolls brought over by the early waves of Jewish immigrants to this country that, are sort of kicking around shops in New York and elsewhere. Beyond the provenance of the scrolls, we just kept asking, why did so many people, sophisticated, educated people who had studied history, why did they believe this? Why did they not smell this out immediately? Now, admittedly, maybe the story he first told me was a little more fantastical, but they all sounded fantastical to me. And why were these scrolls that supposedly had this association with communities that had been destroyed, why were they so powerful? And what does it say about American Jewish identity now, at this point in time, that it is so centered on memory of the Holocaust? There, in fact, was a Pew survey, I think in 2013, that asked American Jews to list important Jewish values. And the value that was named the most by 70% was remembering and honoring the memory of those lost in the Holocaust. That was more people who named that as an important Jewish value than living an ethical life. So make of that what you will, whatever. And why did the Jewish community, which has spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars on Holocaust education and research, and we have this fantastic institution in Washington, this U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, with an amazing research institute with historians who, by the way, if you have ever a question, they answer their phone. They love to talk to you. They really, like to share. Why did nobody pick up the phone and say, can you tell me something about the community in this town? Does this sound plausible? Would a scroll have been hidden? Whatever. No one did. And so, I would say that it was disillusioning, in that sense. And then I, came to several answers. he actually wasn't charging extremely exorbitant prices for these scrolls. There was a little more than what he would charge normally for a used scroll. So maybe people don't, if he'd asked $100,000 or something, maybe people would have said, oh, I better check. But he asked 17 or 20 or $25,000, and you get, and people believe the stories because they wanted to believe them. One of his victims, a man named Robert Kushner, a lawyer in Pittsburgh, bought one of these supposed 2 Torah scrolls that had been dug up from a mass grave in this town, Kamenets-Podilsky, I guess it is in Ukrainian. His father had been from that town. His aunt never emigrated, so she could have ended up in the mass grave. He wanted to believe that there was this symbol of the Jewish faith that somehow survived. He had his grandson read from this scroll at the grandson's bar mitzvah. So, the brother and sister who brought this Torah scroll, supposedly ransomed for gold, wanted to believe that this came from this area of Hungary, brought by a pious Jew who might have been their mother's cousin. Is the brother in this pair told us, my mother lost everybody and everything in the war, and now at least she has this, So then there was another answer that we got from a sociologist who studies Jewish communities, who says, look, people don't like to ask questions about the Holocaust, because if you ask a question, it sounds like you're questioning the whole thing. And then do you sound like a Holocaust denier? So people are sort of sensitive. It sounds like you're saying none of this is true. And honestly, to our dismay, after we published the article, we saw on right-wing websites, there are these websites, they're horrible, like the Daily Stormer or whatever, when, they would write things like, you see, none of this is true, the whole thing is made up. And really, that was kind of my main motivation in just staying focused on this and trying to nail these stories down and make sure, if I was going to ruin somebody's reputation and livelihood, and he did go to jail, that it was absolutely, wasn't just an embellishment, that it truly wasn't true. Because my motivation was, it made me very uneasy when people are embellishing or making up stories or not adhering to the strict historical record of that era. I think it's a dangerous path. Anyway, I've certainly exceeded my time. So those were my questions. I'm sure you have others.
So thank you, Martha. We really appreciate it. It doesn't. I think we should get rid of the video, but I look here. Anyway, okay, Martha. So let me ask the people in the audience. Do you have any questions or comments? So you want to done?
What a fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
My question is, what happened to
I'll repeat it.
The congregations that had bought these or had them donated to them? What was their response to your story?
That's
the question, Martha.
I heard.
Oh,
so you want to repeat it? The question is, what happened to the congregations that had bought these Torah scrolls under false pretenses? Well, some of them kept the Torah scrolls and simply removed the stories from the website. One rabbi, wrote a heartfelt letter to the congregation and said, this is very painful, and I know a lot of people are attacking Martha and Jeff, that's my fellow reporter, because they have exposed this story, which, does not put the Jewish people in a good light. You can imagine any community doesn't, if you're an Armenian American, you don't want to read the story about a bad Armenian American. Okay, this is the case. So this rabbi said, but still, we need to thank them for clarifying the historical record. We're still going to be using the Torah scrolls, and they are still sacred because they are still Torahs, even if they don't have those stories attached to them. This particular synagogue had to really use them as props for its own Holocaust education. It used to have the bar mitzvah kids read from them. David Rubenstein, the billionaire, after we published our story, commissioned a very prominent Holocaust historian, Michael Berenbaum. He was the first director of research at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he asked Michael Berenbaum, could you please research this Torah that I bought from Auschwitz, supposedly rescued from Auschwitz and donated, and the one that was written up in the New York Times. Michael Berenbaum asked the same questions we did and came to some conclusions. This is a fairy tale. And so then David Rubenstein, being a billionaire, secured a couple of actual Holocaust Torahs. I guess he found them in Israel. Somebody had brought anyway, and redonated. But mainly the synagogues just stopped telling the stories, and some of them, had these heartfelt meetings and discussions with their congregations.
Any comments, questions? Martha, you told I remember a story about in advance of the war, when things looked like they were getting bad, the people in Czechoslovakia, synagogues in Czechoslovakia. Okay,
yes. Okay, yeah. So there actually, are genuine Holocaust Torahs in American synagogues, many of them. And this was a very interesting story. After Hitler annexed the Sudetenland, the chief rabbi of Moravia and Bohemia in Czechoslovakia wrote to the congregations and said, this isn't looking good. I think you should send your Torah scrolls to us for safekeeping in Prague. And so they were shipped to Prague from all these towns in Czechoslovakia. And their curators at a Jewish museum cataloged them very carefully, like a index card for each Torah scroll. This one comes from Lidice, this one comes from Brno, whatever. And, had like a number for each one, with the idea that after the war, they would be returned to those communities. And perplexingly, the German occupying authorities actually allowed this Jewish curators to continue working in this museum for a couple of years. The myth, and this is actually not documented, but the story is that Hitler wanted to create a museum to defunct people after he, exterminated all the Jews, whatever. Eventually, those curators were shipped off to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz, but one of them survived, at least. So then you've got 1,400, something like that, Torah scrolls that are in Prague in this one central location, carefully labeled. The war is over, the communist authorities come to power, and there's no Jewish life left. The Jews have been killed or they left for Israel, right? The survivors. These communities are not getting reconstituted. Besides which, we're living under communism now, and they're not interested in, encouraging religious practice. So the Torah scrolls sat in a warehouse. The warehouse actually was a disused church on the outskirts of Prague, and they sat there for years. And then in 1963, the communist government of Czechoslovakia needs hard currency, and they were approached by a Jewish philanthropist in London who said, we'll give you money. And I can't remember what the sum was. I don't know, 58,000, whatever it was. It was some tens of thousands of dollars. If you give us all the Torah scrolls. The Torah scrolls were then shipped to London. And, but, they were all labeled because the curators in the Jewish Museum had numbered everyone. And so the provenance is very clear. I mean, that's a good trail, as Susan will tell you, she's an archaeologist. That's a good, record of provenance. And so they end up in London. They're restored, the ones that are not completely rodent eaten or, moldy or whatever, the ones that are capable of restoration. They had spent many years between 45 and 40, whatever it was, in 63 in a warehouse. So some of them were not in very good shape. But anyway, there is something called the Czech Torah Trust. And it lends out these Torah scrolls to Jewish communities in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, in Canada. And it's also a very powerful symbol here. This is, a remnant of our people. But, that's a genuine thing. We know how they got there.
Judy?
I don't even know how to phrase the question, but we live in a strange world where people believe false news and want to believe it. What kind of parallel can you draw? Is it just an increasing issue? What is it that creates, in a world of educated people, the ability to be so deluded?
Well,
Martha,
I heard that. So the question was a little
yeah.
comparison to where we're living now in the age of Trump, where people just believe just patently false things, and even educated people believe false things. A couple of people have asked me that same question, and I do have to say that although the knee reaction of some of his customers when they first read the article was, I believe him. I think he's a very holy man. He's a wonderful person, and I believe this. Certainly, when he was charged criminally, all those people said, "Oh my God, no, none of this was true. I was duped. I believed it because I wanted to believe it." So the parallel doesn't quite hold up because you've got some people who you just can't get through to them. I would say the truth got through to everyone in this particular case eventually.
Martha, could you explain a little bit about why a Holocaust Torah has extra value? Maybe you could re-explain that.
Yes, okay.
Is it because of a family or a
Yeah, so but the main symbolism, and this is what came through all the time, is, and it was actually, Euless used to say it in a way that I thought was off-putting and just off. He would say, Hitler tried to kill us, but look, we still live through the Torah. We still have our Torah. Well, no, 6 million people were killed, right? But it is this symbol. Hitler wanted to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth. Judaism survives. And now we have bar mitzvah kids reading from this Torah. Maybe everyone in that village was killed, but the Torah survived. So it's a symbol of rebirth. That's and survival. It was very powerful for people. It was so even if you didn't have a parent who was a survivor or a grandparent who was a survivor, it's still this symbol. Look, we still have it. And it is kind of amazing. Look, you go to the Dead Sea Scroll Museum in Jerusalem, and you see, from the caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see this is the same text. There's something kind of thrilling that you're reading every week. The same thing. It's been around for a long time.
And can we follow up a little bit on that and this question of, and I hate to put you on the spot, and as usual, you can just ignore me. But we're really old friends. So any parallels to the situation in Ukraine and what's happening? Do you want to comment on any of that at all?
I don't know where would you see a parallel? I'm not.
Yeah, I don't know. Judy, your question was how this might parallel with what's happening today in Eastern Europe?
No, it was more what's happening here and the gullibility of people and their
Yeah,
clinging to story.
Okay, all right. So
Right.
Never mind. As always, just ignore me. So, okay.
Yeah.
There was one other question. We have a few minutes. Does anyone else have a question? Are there any questions online in the chat?
I'm going to come over here.
Well, there is a question. There's something in the chat. Oh, it's the links. Right. Yeah, it's not a question.
Okay, so when you see this online, there are links to the article in the expose and the Washington Post I think the New York Times article as well. And
Mhm.
if not, email me and I'll get them to you. So,
Mhm.
Let me come over.
sure.
Thank you.
So, yes,
Here I am. Okay, Judy, something,
You're too tall for this.
so it appears.
there you go.
Judy, just something from our family history. A great, great, great grandfather of mine volunteered to join the Prussian army to liberate Europe from Napoleon. So we're talking early 1800s here.
Mhm.
And we've got the letters that he wrote
Wow.
home and his diary,
Amazing.
and amazing stuff. But he got shot right there, right at near the heart. What saved him was he had a small metal bottle in his coat
Oh,
that caught the bullet. That bullet was in our family until 1945. And it still burns me that I don't have it, or nobody in our family has it, because it was a tangible connection
yes.
to that ancestor.
Yes.
And I see a certain parallel here
Yes.
in the love and the willingness to believe that these Torahs were genuine and connected to the Holocaust. It establishes a connection that is
Yes.
just so hard to say, no, this can't be. I miss that connection with my ancestor.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that's a
can't-
great analogy. That's a great analogy.
But it still burns me that I can't get that tangible piece of our family history.
Susan?
Yeah.
Going back to your question about the Ukraine, we wouldn't be around to see it, but do you think that enough of an expose exists from this series of things that if someone tries to pull something similar about Torahs rescued from the Ukraine later on, they won't get anywhere?
Yeah, I think that probably that's true. A lot of these stories actually he did, claim to be where there were in museums and monasteries, and there's like a grain of truth. There are some museums, a museum of Lviv that had it has Torah scrolls. One thing I wanted to add here is though that the organized Jewish community has for a number of years been engaged in negotiations to repatriate or to restore some of these Torah scrolls that are in museums or warehouses or archives in Eastern Europe to Jewish communities. And first of all, there are Jewish communities that after the fall of communism started reconstituting themselves. When I went to Poland to see whether that story that was written up in the New York Times could in any way be true, the found that the head of the small surviving Jewish community in that area said, well, we don't think it's true at all. We don't think it happened. But by the way, if it did happen, that would belong to us. You can't, and so his adventures that he was bragging about raised all kinds of alarms. I didn't even get into. There was, one case that set the Department of Homeland Security off, and we were interviewing him about possible smuggling because he's admitting to antiquities smuggling. This is actually illegal, but there are orderly processes of negotiations that the Jewish community has. Even this story about that first story I heard about that getting the Torah for gold from the Nazi and taking it out of Germany. When I called the German embassy about this to find out if there had been some incident of a rabbi being beaten up on the street or whatever that any record of it, because he claimed to have informed the German embassy, and that, of course there wasn't any such thing. But the press officer at the German embassy said, "Look, this would be illegal. You just cannot smuggle antiquities out, right?" And, the head of the Save a Torah Foundation would make the case, well, these items were stolen from the Jewish people, therefore we can steal them back. The organized Jewish community would say, no, and we're not going to be cowboys and do this. There's a way to get this back. Okay. But yes, I would say it's pretty well known, and after the fall of communism, there was a kind of a Wild West or Wild East, you'd say, black market in antiquities, as you can imagine. All sort of law and order kind of dissolved and whatever. And so there were cases of Torah scrolls being smuggled out of Ukraine in particular. There are a lot of black market sales. That's kind of over now. They're all done now.
Which leads us into a question that came on in the chat from Lee Shapiro. Could you comment on the relationship of the story to the belief in relics of Christ and the saints? And does the power of belief and the desire of belief at some point suppress investigation?
Yes, I think so. There's a book called Rags and Bones by a very fine writer named Peter Manseau. He often writes on Catholic themes. And it's about this very topic of all kinds of relics. The tooth of the Buddha in Sri Lanka. I think he has a whole big chapter on that. The piece of the true cross, the bones of a saint. That's part of it, And people who are people of faith suspend disbelief. We can say, oh, but lots of these congregations, they were sophisticated people. Yes, they're Jewish, but they're not Orthodox Jews who are fundamentalists in their belief. They're skeptical, secular people who are, attached to the culture of Jewish civilization, the ethics of it. But it's kind of religion as metaphor for these people. Why did they? But I think it's a very fair comparison. Again, that was Peter Manseau, Manseau, who wrote that book, Rag and Bone. It's interesting.
Thank you. We're getting about towards the end of our time slot. Does anyone have any other questions or any thoughts, comments, conversation? Martha, do you want to say anything more? Let's just check. Are we okay on the chat and questions? Okay, no more from the offline online audience. They're good. Anybody here in the room? So Martha, do you have any
Yeah. Is there a question?
Whoa, time out. Sorry, what?
Rick online has his hand up.
Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Ken Lindsay and the Monument Men. Ken Lindsay was at Binghamton University for many years. And their task after World War II, I believe it was during and after World War II, was to gather antiquities.
Yes.
Did they have any role here? Thank you for your talk.
Yes, you're welcome. Yes, I think that at one point, and I don't want to go on the record and say, yes, I'm absolutely sure, but I think there were some photos that I saw of Torah scrolls that they uncovered that had been, in a Nazi storeroom somewhere. I will look this up and write to Susan, and we will correct the record. But yes, that was all about being on the hunt for looted objects and restoring them to their rightful owners. It's very interesting. There's a whole process of restitution and restoration. This was started 20 some years ago by, or more, Stuart Eisenstadt, who was a State Department official, in the Carter administration. And there was a conference in Washington, and there were follow-up conferences. As you may recall, there was an effort to get back gold that had been looted by the Swiss, or taken from the Swiss from wealthy Jewish families. And that process of restoration is ongoing. In 2009, there was a follow-up conference in Terezin in the Czech Republic, where Theresienstadt was. Actually, the conference was in Prague, and then the last day was in Terezin. And it's all about restoration of paintings and also ritual objects that were taken. Yeah, it's part of the same process.
Martha, are we good on other questions? It's partly because we're getting towards lunchtime, but also
Yeah.
because you use the term kosher. These are
Yeah.
kosher Torahs. And as I recall, you talked about being able to, the restoration, people could taste the difference in the inks that were used, or is that
Not
just-
taste. No. Like any kind of, okay, look.
It is lunchtime.
You
Okay, go ahead.
examine a painting and you say, this looks like paint that was manufactured in the, I don't know, 17th century or the 18th, right? You could look at that, right? Or you could look at a style and you can say, oh, it's an impressionistic style. I guess this, could, well have been painted, in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? I mean, and it's the same thing with calligraphy, right? You look and you say, oh, this looks like the handwriting that was favored, the calligraphy that was favored by people in a certain place. And I'm sure there are specifications for the ink, and I'm sure it might have varied from place to place a bit. But I don't recall anybody saying, oh, this ink is certain, but I do recall speaking to scribes who would talk about the different calligraphy. And also parchment, types of parchment are favored at, in different
So
places.
some of these could be complete, complete reconstructions, not just,
There's no, okay, stop. There's no such thing as this reconstruction fake, no. Okay. A Torah is a Torah is a Torah, right? So it's like saying Abraham Lincoln read this Bible during the Civil War, and it was a great comfort to him. You look at the Bible, it was published in 1840 in the United States. Yeah, it's plausible that he read such an, but but it's still a Bible, right? So no, these were old Torahs. They didn't have any antiquing on them or anything like that. There are a lot of old Torahs kicking around. They're really,
okay.
I mean, people say, oh, did he counterfeit a Torah? There's no counterfeit something that's an identical copy. Every Torah is the same text. It's immutable. So I guess you could say, oh, somebody wrote a new one and then, buried it underground to make it look old or something like that. No, that wasn't the case. There are enough old Torahs that are pretty cheap, that are kicking around on the Lower East Side in a Torah scribe's shop, that you just go and buy one for $5,000 and you sell it for $15,000 and you say that you rescued it from Auschwitz.
Oh, right. Okay, well, thanks very much for, this is really wonderful.
Anyway, all right, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your attention and interest.
All right, well, we're good. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Okay,
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.